Welcome to Lifafa, Professor Rohini Godbole. We are very excited to have you here with talking to us today.
It's a pleasure.
So I'm going to start off straight away with the questions. To start with, so could you tell us a little bit about your field? What is high energy physics?
Okay. Actually, it just sounds very fancy, but it's a very simple thing when you look at it in the end. It's simply the question of what everything around is made up of and how it is held together. So, if you want to really know, the subject of high energy physics is the branch of science which deals with what everything around us is made up of and how does it work. And if you like, this is the query that has propelled the development of science as a discipline from the beginning of, the journey into science by the humankind. Beginning from the Greeks and the Hindu sages who talked of Panchamahabhutas to now. So that is the subject of high energy physics. Is that simple enough?
Yes, I
Okay,
think so.
maybe I should add one more thing. Why do you call it? Okay, it's also alternatively called elementary particle physics. So that title is much more consistent with the explanation I gave you. But then why do we call it high energy physics also? That has to do with the fact, goes back to a simple thing which almost all of us study in school. That when we want to look at something through a microscope and we want to have a high resolving power, what do? We use light of smaller and smaller wavelengths. And smaller wavelengths means higher and higher frequencies. I think all of us know that from school. And higher frequencies, as again all of us know, mean higher energies. So to look at matter at shorter and shorter distance scales, that is with higher and higher resolution, we need higher and higher energies. Hence, elementary particle physics is also what we call high energy physics. So if you like, elementary particle physics is the name that a theorist will give. High energy physics is the name that a person who does experiments will give it to it. So it is just two sides of a coin. Okay?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And since you spoke about beginnings, what about your beginning? What inspired you to take up this field? Could you tell us a little bit about, your childhood?
Okay, actually, this is perhaps the simplest part of my own story, I think. In the sense that, to be honest, in my family, there were engineers, there were doctors, not many, and there were many more lawyers, many more, linguists and what have you. So I don't think that I even knew what is meant by being a scientist, let alone being a high energy physicist. So to some extent, doing science simply was a bit of an accident, bit of a natural continuation of the fact that I was a brilliant maths student. And if you want to, I will take a little bit of time to tell you the story, because I went to an all-girls school. And in that school, we didn't even study science till I was in 8th grade of school. So that means first we were studying home science. So actually, mind you, I studied a lot of things: how to keep house, how to preserve food, how to cook, how to sew, everything. But I had not studied science. But then what happened was that there used to be, in those years, this is long back, we are talking of 1960, or maybe 1 or 2 years before that, give and take. And there used to be a state level scholarship, at which point from my school, nobody used to get it because there was one paper in science. And we had not studied science, and this was in 7th grade. We started saying science only in 8th grade. So nobody from my school would ever get it. And somehow some of my teachers, my maths teacher particularly, said, you're really good in maths. Maybe we should try to help you study some science. So it is these three teachers, I think, who took the trouble working with me and teaching me science on a weekend that first got me into science. So that was the beginning, as it were. Okay. And then since we didn't have too many good science teachers in the school, obviously, because it was taught only for 4 years, one of my teachers said that she was my maths teacher. And she said, my husband teaches science. He was also a science teacher. He teaches at home. Maybe you should start coming to our house in the evening. And then he exposed me to the world of science. And then the real reason I think I'm here sitting and saying that I'm doing science is because I got something called the Science Talent Search Scholarship, which only requirement was that you should do pure science. You should not go to engineering or medical. And I never wanted to do either. But mind you, I wanted to do a PhD either in Sanskrit or mathematics. And it is by chance that I decided, very pragmatically, I thought that if I did mathematics, I won't have a job. If I do physics PhD, maybe I'll have a job. And in the end, I ended up doing theoretical physics, which is not all that different from mathematics, if you wish. But so what I'm trying to suggest is that it was just the curiosity and various chances which came my way, some schemes which the government introduced for young students to go into pure science. Because I went to Indian Institute of Technology simply because I had the scholarship. I mean, I was first in the university in BSc. Getting admission was not an issue. But I don't think my parents could have afforded to keep me in Bombay, away from Pune. We were a typical middle-class family. So you understand that it was the natural conclusion of all the different, but we don't realize the schemes that were set in place so that young people should get attracted to science. Then I attended Science Talent summer schools. I met friends for life. Many of them are doing science today. And then because I went to Indian Institute of Technology and I had this fantastic teacher, and I still to date, cannot stop talking about him. So one person called Professor S.H. Patil, who brought home to me that doing theoretical physics is an art. And it got me hooked. So that is the beginning. Okay. And the beginning was in a small problem in an examination where everybody else and me, we were trying to solve the problem. And I finished in 5 minutes. Everybody was sitting around. And that one problem was the only exam. And then this teacher of mine came and said, why are you sitting? You can't do anything. I said, no, but I think I finished. And then he said, if you have finished it so fast, you have it right. Go. And that is that was the moment. I mean, I can even pinpoint the moment when I realized that theoretical physics is just a story of a few actions. And you take those actions to their logical conclusion, develop the mathematical framework, and then, but there is yet something more than that compared to mathematics, and then compare whether this is anywhere realized in nature. And that got me hooked. So that is the beginning. Okay. And quite apart from that, the time again that I'm talking to you, which was 72, I think particle physics and nuclear physics were at the top of the pile because they were the subjects, as we said, dealing with the most fundamental laws of nature, of the most elementary constituents of matter. So it is like the heady times for particle physics, like the times are now for astronomy. With now, you detect gravitational waves. So if I were today doing something, I would most probably do astronomy or astrophysics.
So that's something that I need to mention here. I have known you now for nearly 30 years, and you were definitely one of my role models growing up. I think I've been I've been fangirling like nobody's business since the day I met you. So you already spoke about some of your professors and teachers, but who were your role models growing up? People you knew or people who you knew about?
Okay. I don't think I had a role model in science because I didn't know any scientists almost, or I didn't know what it is to do science. But I think I had role models to begin with in my own parents and my own mother, actually. Actually, both my mother and father in their own ways. And I'll tell you what it was. My mother, in fact, was, when she was married, she had only done second year of college. And after the 3 daughters were born, all of us, she did her BA. Then my 4th sister was born. So there was a break. Then she did her MA. Then she was going on to do her PhD. At which point the teacher, my headmistress in my school said, look, she was a great dramatist and great linguist. So why are you doing a PhD? Please do BA. We would love to have you in our school. And my mother did her bachelor's of education the year I was in last year of BSc. So we went to college together. We studied together. I taught mathematics to my mother because she was, being a girl, her mathematics education had stopped when she was in 6th grade because there was no female teacher to teach mathematics at that time. So for me, this was the role model, okay? Somebody who knew that she wanted to do something and she achieved it, keeping at the same time fulfilling, which was great, of course. And I will come to it. It set me back a little bit because she was my ideal. And I thought that you had to work on all fronts equally effectively. But I realized that not all of us can be superwomen like she was. And I tell you, I realize it even more now with the lockdown, in the sense that here was a lady who absolutely was a perfect housewife, did all kinds of things at home, and then she was leading this very intellectually fulfilling life. And when she didn't have this job, she was doing many kind of intellectual activities all the time. And I think she was my role model, if you ask me. In science, the role models were many, in the sense that, you grew up reading stories of Raman and Chandrasekhar and Marie Curie, and those were the, heights you wish to aspire as a young child when you said that you're going to do science. But the role model, I would really say, was my mother. I think I'm very lucky to have had her as a mother. I mean, from my father, I learned different things, but they're not that relevant. I mean, I learned from him logic. I learned from him the art of logical arguments because he was an economist, in fact. So I think I learned from them a lot, which I later, the skills I used in science, but I didn't learn them at that time because they were going to be useful in science. I hope I have given you some feel of this.
Absolutely. So one of the other things that you do, which would even now be considered, which you did, which would even now be considered rather unusual, is that after your PhD, instead of taking up the postdoc position at a very famous university abroad, you chose to come back to India, and you chose to join as a lecturer in Mumbai University and start teaching there. So first question is, what made you do that? And then how did that affect your career as a physicist? And then now, as after all these years as a experienced professor and scientist, what advice would you give physicists and students who are not from the elite institutes?
No.
Based on this.
These are many questions in one.
Yes.
Okay. But I would try to give you an answer without going too much off track. Actually, the answer why I came back is very simple. After 5 years, I was just homesick. It's very serious. I mean, because you didn't have that much Indian fraternity outside India at that time. Then being a woman student, you were in a minority strictly. And more than that, maybe I'm just a home person, but I wanted to come home. I don't think it was the smartest of the decision I took. Okay. Later events proved that it did not affect my journey in science, but I think it's a matter of luck a bit. And I feel that that is where now when I look back, I feel that the mentoring was not positive enough. I mean, if I had a student and the student was, going back to a less endowed place. I was not, by the way, when I came back from US, I was not in the Bombay University. I had gone to the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, where I spent 3 years, and where I think I, ended up doing rather good work for 3 years. But the point I'm making is that I think when I look back, my advisor was perhaps saying, okay, now she has finished her PhD. Anyway, she has to go back and, get on with life, which is a euphemism for saying that, settle in life, get married and whatever. And career is just one part of it. So it doesn't matter if she goes back home. This is my own thinking. So now when I look back, I think it was not a very good mentorship on his part. But okay, I'm not clear to me that I would have listened to him. I came home. So I would not advise everybody to take that kind of decision, because in a scientist's life, the period you spend apprenticing as a postdoctoral fellow is actually the time when you establish yourself and say, this is me. When you write papers which people will recognize as your paper. And to some extent, that was a mistake. But then, as I said, I didn't go back to university at that time. I came back to Tata Institute. And I think in those 3 years, I was able to set up very useful collaborations. And I think I wrote a few papers. One of my earliest best cited papers I wrote at that time. And it was not just citation. Those papers really were very, how should I say? They were nice papers. So indeed, I was lucky, and not everybody should do that. But then I did, since I am anticipating a question which you're going to ask me later, and I'm going to include part of that answer here, is at that time in India, there were not too many jobs available for young theoretical physicists, okay, and particle physicists at that. So I ended up actually taking the job in Pune, Bombay University. Part of the reason being that it was close to home, close to family, because otherwise I had possibilities of going to Kanpur IIT and things like that, but I chose this. So again, that was perhaps not the sanest and the best decision. But again, because of I think here I have to acknowledge the help, and more than help, the friendship of a lot of my colleagues in TIFR, who had seen whatever abilities I possessed, who could see my desire to continue doing science, and who helped me also in their own way. That help can be very simple. Help can be, you can use the computer, or I will issue the books from the library for you. Particularly because I was a theorist. For an experimentalist, it wouldn't have been possible. So what happened was that in spite of the fact that I was working in Bombay University, for all practical purposes, for research purposes, I was a member of the theoretical physics group of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. And they respected my research. We were friends, we were colleagues in some ways, and the research continued. So the advice that I would, since you asked me, that I would give to an aspiring scientist who is quote unquote not in the elite institutions, is that what really matters at the end of the day is the fire that burns within you. And when people are convinced of that fire, people are convinced by your acts and by the results. When you convince people of the abilities that you have, which you can put to good use in science, most of the time, I think science, in some sense, is pretty democratic, and people actually, okay, it depends a lot on the recipients. Like you have to be lucky like me, namely that I had the people at the other end who cared about science. But I think a good scientist always cares about science. So if you can find a good scientist who cares about science and give him or her the indication of nothing else but your passion, things can work out. And now, of course, things have changed, particularly for theorists. You don't really need to be at one of the elite institutions, because those days you needed it for computing, you needed it for library, you need it for the atmosphere, you need it for discussions. But now with the internet, and I think with COVID lockdowns, it has become, no, it's amazing how much you realize that you can do with distance. So in this new COVID normal, actually, it doesn't really matter which institute you are in. And I think what really, really matters is you find the right people. And there always exists some subset of people in these so-called elite institutions which care only about science, And then things work. That's my long answer, but since you had a long question, I tried to.
Thank you. So, I mean, as a, somebody who's not a physicist, what are the common career paths for someone who studies physics? I mean, what would they do?
No, that's actually a very, very nice question. Because just because you study physics, and even if that you do even a PhD, doesn't mean that, research is the only way. Of course, for me, if I couldn't have done research, I feel I would have felt very suffocated. So, but that not everybody feels that way. But doing a PhD in physics, or doing even a master's in physics, gives you a training which you can almost use in any other career path. I mean, you can be, if you study condensed matter physics and materials, you can go into, industry, where you can do very important contributions, where your knowledge as a physicist plays an extremely important role. Or on the other hand, as a good scientist, a good physicist, you can go into even these days the economics, or by because econophysics or what have you. Not the point is that as a physicist you get this training of attacking a problem in a mathematical fashion, beginning from a few first principles and knowing the laws of the game, rules of the game. Laws are nothing but rules of the game. What would be the end result? And therefore, you of course have choice of doing research. You of course have choice of teaching physics, which of course is, believe me, teaching is again a joy. And for some of the people, that can be a very important career path. But other career paths are simply moving on into other areas where you can bring to act, use the various techniques that we use, or that we develop. For example, I can tell you this: when I was in Bombay University, we started a new option, as they used to call it, solid state electronics. And believe me, we used to have only 5 students there out of 50 in that particular branch, 5 or 8, maybe in the beginning 5, and then we took it to 8. And believe me, the industries wanted to hire these people much more than they would hire an engineer. And that was simply because with training in physics, they brought something more to the table. So in that sense, this is even just remaining in science and technology. There are many, many openings for a person who studies physics. And quite apart from that, of course, the common thing, the computational skills get you into software. And if you have predilection for that, for example, particularly in high energy physics, and both in theory and experiment, we use the ultimate complicated computational algorithms. And as you know very well, I have told you many times that even the network, the World Wide Web was invented at CERN by particle physicists to share the data. So a typical particle physicist, experimental or theorist, knows about many modern techniques of computation, like grid computing, like cloud computing, these days artificial intelligence. People use that. I know, for example, I have a student who is right now using the methods of developing methods based on artificial intelligence to see how a particular kind of particle, if it is produced at the Large Hadron Collider, how one will find the signature, how one will find a needle in the haystack of the collisions at the Large Hadron Collider. And he is actually using artificial intelligence. Now imagine, he may not continue doing physics, but he will bring that, he can go anywhere, he can write his own ticket. So in short, studying physics, apart from being extremely enjoyable, actually prepares you for a whole lot of technical things, and there is no end almost. Okay.
So the next question would be, if one continues to stay in physics or in general in pure sciences, it's often said that one does all one's best work before they are 30. So is this really true, or is this just a stereotype? And, what would this mean for somebody who has taken a break from their career, either to have children or because they want to do something else or because they were sick? And, say they've taken a break and they want to get back to science and technology. How would you, what advice would you give them?
Okay, to begin with, I think this is just one of those euphemisms that you do of course, it's quite common that people, when they're young, the important thing is that one is bursting with enthusiasm. Also, one is not afraid to ask difficult questions. And therefore, very often, many important things people do before they're 30. But that doesn't mean that as you grow older, you don't do good work. Okay. In fact, I mean, it really depends on how the fire is burning inside you, that whether you continue to do good work. And it's a matter of chance. Doing good work, I find, it's a lot of hard work, but, I will tell you, according to me, what happens. Working or doing a scientific investigation, research, is like, walking. I like to think of it as walking on a seashore and sifting through the sand, looking at, do I have a diamond here somewhere, and you're looking at a piece of different grains of sands, and suddenly a light ray comes and you say, oh my God, I have found a diamond. We had a person who is a Nobel laureate in condensed matter physics who described the process exactly like this. He says, we walk on the seashore, you pick up, you're trying to see whether I have a stone which converts things into gold, whatever that stone is called. And then you need to be careful, because sometimes you will throw away in your preoccupation with testing, you will throw away the stone which you have found, which would actually change things into gold. So what I'm really trying to say is that chance plays a fair amount of, according to me, an important role. So the first question, I think, is just in my mind, it's an old wives' tale. There is a high chance that you will do very bright work when you are young, but that doesn't mean that you will do good work only when you are young. I hope that settles it. Now about people who take a break. I want to tell you a story of a woman. Her name is Evelyn C. I forget what the C stands for. Pielou, Pielou. And she is perhaps called very justifiably the mother of statistical ecology or mathematical ecology. She finished her BSc when she was 27. Part of it was because this was a period of the war. So she missed a few years. Then she got married. So by the time she worked on her PhD or work, she just worked. raising 3 children, essentially at home, but she had somebody who understood the fire, who understood her abilities, and gave her the appropriate support so she could apply for a PhD at the University of London. And she got her PhD at the age of 38, and she got a permanent job at the age of 42. And she ended up doing and fundamental work and formulating the mathematical subject that we know as mathematical and statistical ecology. So I rest my case. Okay. And all I would say, again, my answer is the same. If you really have the passion, your age or the place or the time when you're trying to get back to work into the field are just numbers. Your passion is the most important thing, and an idea that you want to implement. Perhaps if you just want to keep on doing routine work, then having had a break, having a break is never very good, okay? Particularly if you're an experimental physicist, because the instruments change. You may not even be able to learn the new instruments. But I think if you have the passion, if you have the desire, if you have an idea what you want to do, you can do it. Your age is just a number. And I like to think that that's really true. Okay.
Thanks. So while I was, looking through things about you on the internet before this interview, so I found a list of your publications, which is, I think that was only up to 2018. So there must be even more now. And that list was over 30 pages long. And I know that, you continue to do great work even today. But what was, were there any big setbacks in your career, and how did you overcome that?
Okay. One of the first setbacks I already mentioned to some extent, that I think a lack of enthusiastic support when I was young, when I was trying to establish myself. For example, this particularly, as I told you, this not at that time, after finishing my postdoctoral experience in the Tata Institute, I was actually in the University of Bombay. And people who I used to work with in TIFR told me, now I think you can forget about research because there is so much teaching to do, you will not have any time to do research. So that was to some extent a setback. But I think I was lucky, as I told you. But I definitely had the fire burning within me that I do not want to stop doing research. I do not want this to be the end of my research. And at that time, I had people, even in the University of Bombay physics department, who believed in me, who believed in this passion, and they supported me. They realized that at that time, distant research and distant communications were not so easy. So I would go to TIFR almost every day from Bombay University, because there was nobody in Bombay University who was doing particle physics. And just across 30 kilometers across the town, there were at least 20 people who were very good and who were working in the subject. So I would go there maybe 3-4 times a week in the afternoons after I finished my teaching in the university, talk to my students, taken care of them, taken care of the labs. And he would understand it, the head of my department. So his is also a name I would like to record here with great appreciation, that it was not just me who overcome this. It was people, friends like him, Professor Rangwala, and also the large number of my young colleagues in the Tata Institute, in the theoretical physics group, young students, young postdocs, as well as people in Tata Institute who were not even from theoretical physics group, but who would help me with small things, such as issuing journals out of the main library, getting things Xerox for me, You might laugh because you people are in a generation where information is at the tip of your fingers. But 30 years ago, things were not exactly that way. So I think there was a setback there, but I was lucky to get support from all these people. I was also lucky to have some nice ideas, which I could, carry out in good publications, which I could translate into good publications, and which people appreciated those publications. So things moved. So all I can say is that it was a good combination of some good Samaritans and some good luck, some smart ideas. And that did it for me.
So on a more positive note, what are the proudest moments of your career and why?
Actually, these proud moments are very difficult to, it's like asking a person to say which of your children you like best, because you kind of think, each of the things has its own place. But I'll tell you the first one, which I felt I was very, very, I don't know whether it's proud, but a moment which I still remember. And this had to do, again, this was the time when I was juggling many balls. I had a job in the Bombay University. I used to be married at that time to a German physicist. So we would meet only in vacations. So I had a life as a professor in Bombay University. I had a life as a wife of a physicist, German physicist, and running that part of my life. And of course, a researcher in high energy physics. So I had these three hats and I was moving and juggling these three hats together. And sometimes in the middle of it, you would actually wonder, my God, is it worth it? And of course, I think I also was working extremely hard, sometimes almost working 48 hours, trying to cram 48 hours in a 24-hour day. But in all that, what happened is that I went for a conference. And when we were coming back at the airport, a Japanese colleague who was also at the conference, we were walking. And in the middle of Frankfurt airport, we were going two ways because I was to go to my flight. He was going to go to his flight. And then he suddenly said, by the way, I never asked you. We have been together for the last few days. But let me ask you, are you the author of such and such paper? So I said, yeah, that's my paper. And the man actually, the Japanese, the way Japanese are, of course, he bowed down and said, I respect that paper. And to tell you the truth, that's one moment where all the troubles I was taking, all the hard work that I was putting up, all these many juggling of hats that I was doing, at that one moment, I felt this was all worth it. Not because he praised on me, but because he appreciated that work as that I was able to contribute to knowledge in the area of particle physics, which people actually said found worth respecting. And that I would think, as given the, when I just expose it against the background, this was perhaps one of the proudest moments that I ever felt. But to be honest, I would also say that I was very proud when some work that I had done and calculations that we had done were actually confirmed by experiments. There were 2 or 3 such occasions, and I think I feel very proud of those 2-3 occasions without any doubt. And last but not the least, I was attending a conference and somebody came and said, oh, by the way, you lectured me in the CERN summer school in 2011. I still remember those lectures. And I can tell you, that too was a proud moment. So I have given you a variety of proud moments for a variety of reasons. And getting Padma Shri, I have to accept, I felt very happy that it was a culmination of all these proud moments into one single proud moment.
So you're a absolute leader in your field, but not everybody gets to become Professor Rohini Godbole. So what would be your tip or advice to people from other fields? How could they lead in their respective fields?
I think Okay, I think one of the things you have to do is develop confidence in yourself. And confidence is different. I mean, this has to be confidence based on, backed by results. That you have to judge your own actions, your own thoughts, and see what are your capabilities. And then, but once you have judged them correctly, because you are the only one who can judge them. So judge yourself correctly, but after having judged them, have confidence in yourself. And don't let others tell you what you can do and what you cannot. You have to decide that for yourself. You have to set your own goals. Set your goals with good thinking. But once you have set your goals, don't waver for them. And then I think the rest comes, the rest follows. Because the most important thing is being sure of aim. That helps you to, be a trailblazer. That helps you to lead. That helps you to charter and new paths.
So you have also, you've taught hundreds of students, and you also often talk to youngsters in schools and colleges. So what is the single most important bit of advice that you would give young people today?
What I said just now was not very different than that. Follow your own dreams, okay? And don't be timid about backing yourself. And then, you just go ahead, go on and follow your dreams. And then truly sky is the limit. That's how I feel about it. That sometimes we sell ourselves short. Don't sell yourself short.
So there could be, there would be many moments of happiness in your life when you're, felt really contented. So amongst them, can you share the one moment that really tips the scale, that's on top of the list?
In science or otherwise?
Anything at all. It's all life.
I think I already told you a few of them. And okay, to be honest, I have been lucky, I think. I have had a good life and I have had a lot of moments that I enjoy. And I cannot pick up one like this, but I think the moments when I've been happy most is when I'm among fellow scientists and where, while doing science, I have found something which others at that time didn't know. So as a scientist, those have been the proudest moments that I've had. That I say, aha, this is something about laws of nature that I know and others do not. And I have found it. So that's like finding a new shortcut. That's like, I have on my desktop, I have a mountain. So I can say that is like finding a new pathway on this mountain. And such moments, there have not been many. There have been a few about, for example, in science, I can tell you only in science, I can tell you one or two discoveries or calculations that I made. And this had to do with the fact that I don't know, I was maybe 35, 38-ish. So above 30, by the way, when we found out a new way of me and a collaborator of mine, a German collaborator, we found out a new way of calculating what happens when two high energy photons collide against each other. And when one very high energy photon collides against a proton. I mean, these kinds of many aspects of these interactions were very well known, and they are encapsulated in what we call now electrodynamics. This was very well known since 1958. But somehow we were able to look at a corner of this theory that was not explored and which required looking at it with new eyes. And that's where we found an effect which indeed experiments confirmed. And to me, that was, and these experiments were not planned to confirm, they were not, I mean, they had not planned the experiment to confirm our prediction, okay? The experiments were going to be performed, and we pointed out that our hypothesis, our ideas could be tested in these experiments. And indeed, one of the first things that came out of that experiment was a test of our prediction, which matched with what we had been trying to say. And that, I would say, was really a cool moment. As a theorist, you cannot hope for anything better. So I don't know if I have understood your question and if I have conveyed you the answer.
Well, I think it sort of flows into my next question. So you may have answered that partly as well, but I'd anyway ask. So you've done a lot of work over a very long career. So which of all your work do you hold dearest to your heart, and why? That's first question. The second thing is, because we're all lay people, could you explain this, in layman terms? And then could you also tell us about what the other subjects are that you work on?
Okay. So then I can see that I have, without meaning to, I have indeed sort of moved into your next question. So what I already tried to say, and I repeat, is that as a scientist, one of the proudest moment always has been, or the coolest moment, is when as a scientist you know something that others did not know. So I wanted to give you this one particular example, and it's very easy to understand, so I hope. So let me try to explain. Is that, in particle physics, as I told you, the subject of particle physics actually says, is really about how what are the fundamental constituents and how do they interact with each other. Because when you say what everything is made up of, it's not enough to say that things are made up of these blocks. You also have to know how those blocks are glued together. So the world of particle physics is the story of these bricks and the mortar. And one of the bricks are the electrons, okay? That this, the atoms are made up of electrons and nuclei. And how these electrons interact with another nucleus, or how does it interact with another electron, is through electromagnetic interaction, simple things which all of us know, Coulomb forces, or with electric and magnetic fields which are generated by the charges, etc., etc. So if you took two photons and if they collided with each other, what would happen? So this theory, in fact, actually tells that when two photons collide with each other, X, Y, Z things should happen. The theory gives you a way to compute it. Okay. Now, what we realized is that on an extremely short time scale, the photon can be looked upon as a pair of a particle, pair of a quark and an antiquark. And by uncertainty principle, the photon cannot remain as that pair for a very long time because the energy and momentum are not conserved. So therefore, it again goes on becoming a photon. And this basically means that a very high energy photon, when it is traveling, it's all as though there is a cloud of quarks and antiquarks that's around this photon. And normally the effect of this cloud was not taken into account when people calculated collisions of two photons on each other in this well-established theory called quantum electrodynamics. And what we found is that the energy of the photon increases, the effect of this cloud around this photon is actually very significant and changes the nature in which the two photons can interact with each other. So in that sense, that was a very, very interesting technical thing. And as I said, it was very important. Also, people felt that this is the thing I was talking in my earlier answer. And when we told them that there was a collider at that time in KEK in Japan, It's a big accelerator lab where they were colliding beams of electrons and positrons, and in each electron-positron collisions, there was a situation where the photons could collide with each other, and we had whatever we had suggested as the specifics of the collisions were indeed found to be true by the experimentalists. But this is really true and very technical and not of much interest to anybody outside the world of particle physics. But then came something out of it which was very, very interesting. If we extended our theoretical predictions to very high energy photons, and what is meant by very high energy photons? So, as you know very well, E is equal to mc square. So I would calculate energy in, okay, you don't even need mc square. Energy, as you know, is for 1 eV, for example, is the energy that an electron gains when it goes through 1 volt of potential difference. So in particle physics, normally the energies are measured in units of electron volts. This is the natural unit for particle physics. You can convert this into the usual units of energy if you want in ergs, etc. But right now I would use this 1 electron volt as my unit. When the energies of the photons become of the order of giga electron volts, that means 10 to the 6 eV, then something very interesting happens, and the interactions of the clouds of the quarks and anti-quarks around the photons actually dominate the interactions of the photons with each other themselves. This is what we just found out as we extrapolated our calculations. At this point, again, it would have been a completely pure theoretical matter of interest to particle physicists and nobody else. But then we realized that people who are planning to build the high energy electron positron colliders, which is what at that time was being planned, and that collider is still not made. I'm talking of 30 years ago, and in particle physics, a journey of 30 years is very normal in the history of colliders. But at that time, these colliders were being thought of. And that as an engineer, you would understand this very well, that if a collider is circular, that is, if you're moving a charged particle is moving in a circle, you have to put in a lot of energy so that the particle will remain moving in a circular orbit. But when the energies of the electrons increase, the energy that you have to keep to fix and force the particle to a circular orbit is very high. So for high energy colliders, people actually thought that what was easiest was to just bring 2 beams of electron and positron accelerated by simple things, letting them accelerate through potential differences, and bring the 2 beams of electrons and positrons, and bam. And this was the kind of design that was very popular at that time. But now came the next problem, that if you have such electron-positron colliders where the collisions happened only once, you had to have a very large number of electrons and positrons in each beam, in each bunch that was colliding, because it was just once in a lifetime collision, and after that everything was going to be lost. As opposed to a circular collider where things keep on circulating at least 1 million times, which means that a bunch of electrons and positrons in a linear collider is about 10 to the 6 times thicker than in the circular collider. Now, when you have such big and thick bunches of large number of electrons and positrons, underlying each electron-positron collision, very high energy photons get emitted. And then our calculations indicated that along with each electron-positron collision, the photon-photon collisions that we thought will happen will actually mess up the environment in the collider completely, because you won't be able to figure out what's happening, and you won't be able to use the collider to probe the interactions among fundamental particles at all. So in that sense, this pure academic question that we had asked actually had implications for designing the next generation colliders. And that people figured out, after we had pointed it out, how to reduce the number of these photons that will be produced along with each electron-positron bunch collision. And once they had understood the badness of this feature, one actually designed the bunches of electrons and positrons such that these high energy photons won't be produced. So to me, this is what you see, that a scientist and sitting in the lab doing some academic calculations actually then goes and have implications for an accelerator physicist as to what happens when you're trying to generate and build the next generation colliders. So I don't know if that has conveyed anything, but these are the two pieces of work that as a young person, I was very proud of. But now the other big aspect that I work on is actually something that you have read in the newspapers about, and that is the Higgs boson, which was discovered at the Large Hadron Collider about 10 years ago now. And since the beginning of my career, me and a lot of people in my generation have worked on how to look for this Higgs boson at the collider experiments and how to determine its properties. And these properties have implications, in fact, for solving some as yet unsolved problems of nature, such as the dark matter. They hold key perhaps to the dark matter problem. They hold the key perhaps to why the universe contains much more matter than antimatter. That is why we don't meet ourselves made out of antimatter and just collide and lost. So therefore, these kinds of questions can be in fact asked at the collider through a study of the properties of the Higgs boson. And at present, that's what I'm really doing. I usually suggest, as a theoretical physicist, different measurements that the experimental physicists can make, particle physicists can make, and so as to test corners of these fundamental particle theories. So it's like everybody picks up a corner, because these are very complex theories, and one says, how can I test this corner further? How can I consider what are the implications of this corner of the theory for the laws of the universe? And right now I've given you an example. I have been trying to study how studying the properties of the Higgs boson very accurately, in fact, would lead us to perhaps the answers to the questions such as what is the dark matter in the universe, or why there is more matter in the universe than antimatter. So this is what I'm trying to do right now. And this is one of my, these topics have formed the basis of the thesis of few of my students in the past decade. So I hope this gave you some flavor.
Oh yes, it was very interesting. And I am now going to pick up a corner of what you said about dark matter, and related to the goddess for today. We're recording this for Navratri, and the goddess that we of today is Kalaratri. So she's also the goddess of darkness, but she's called Kalaratri because it's derived from Kala, which is time.
Yeah.
And what she can do is she can stop or end time. Now, as a physicist, what would this mean from a physics point of view?
Frankly, I mean, now we go into subject of metaphysics, if I have to talk about this. Because in terms of physics, I think we know what is the start of the time, so to say, because we know how the universe started. End of the time is something that we are not even able to imagine, because as a physics concept, okay, in the sense that the start of the time has a very precise meaning, and that's the Big Bang universe. But after that, more or less, the flow of time is indeed continuous, and most of our physics theories are based on this fabric of space and time. And nowadays, in fact, people are beginning to think of theoretical scenarios where even the space and time sort of emerges out of some basic fundamental mess. So we are able to talk of emergence of time, but I don't think physics can talk in terms of end of time. So this is my understanding, that physics simply does not have a concept as such as end of time in physics.
Interesting. But getting back to goddesses, or the goddesses in us, who, according to you, is a strong woman? How would you define that?
Okay, I think that's not a very difficult question, because whether it's a strong woman or man, it's, for me, I would have just talked about a strong person. Okay, and I think a strong person is a person who evaluates the convictions and being sure of one's convictions, having evaluated them and making sure that they are on the correct premises, that the convictions are based on correct premises. I think the strong person then follows the path according to his or her convictions. And to me, that is where the strength lies, that realizing, knowing your aim very clearly, and then chartering a path, whether it's in adversity or otherwise, towards that goal, and not giving up, not deviating from that path, is actually, according to me, is the strength in your mind. And you may have to stop at points, you may have to make adaptations to your path, but as long as it's very clear that you're trying to achieve your goal, that's what a really strong person would be doing, according to me.
So the last question for today, which is, what is the one question you wish people would ask you in interviews or conversations, but they never do? And, could you also then answer it, please?
Okay. So the one question I wish people would ask is, how does a researcher or a community of scientists know when to give up pursuing a particular idea? Examples can be Ptolemy's epicycles. Ptolemy had his idea of geocentric universe, and in the beginning, he built this epicycles. Then people who found new evidences which did not agree with his original theory with epicycles built epicycles on epicycles, and it took quite some time before, in spite of Copernicus and Galileo and so on, till the time of Kepler, when it came and people finally accepted that geocentric theory of universe was simply not acceptable. Or even Thomson's plum pudding model, or Hoyle-Nordica's steady state universe, which, by the way, would have a stop in time. Okay, so that could be one answer to your question, that there was a theory such as steady state universe, where or the big crunch, where the universe would end it all, and that would have been the stopping of the time. But those ideas have been now proved to be wrong. But what I'm saying is that these ideas lived for a long time before they were actually disproved. That is a very, very big examples. But in individual scientist's life, this question can always arise. Your student is doing a thesis problem, and after doing for 2.5 years, now you ask, am I going to continue spending good money after the bad, throwing good money after the bad, or do we change the direction? And how do you understand this? That whether should you change the line of attacking the problem, should you change the question that you are asking, so that, and still have an answer, get an answer, so that change the question to something that you can answer, but and still have still keep the question such that the answer would be of interest not just to yourself but to the community, and then it will add to the progress. So for me, there is one important aspect of research that very often we do not think about, that how do you decide that a particular problem needs the line of attack needs to be changed, or the problem needs to be changed. And I think that, to me, is perhaps one of the most frustrating and the most difficult part of research. And I won't give you the answer because I don't have one, but experience, of course, teaches you quite a few things. So there is an interesting quote by Arthur C. Clarke, which throws some light on this. He says that if an elderly but distinguished scientist says that something is possible, he's almost certainly right. But if he says that it's impossible, he's very probably wrong. So only thing I don't like in this quote is that he thinks that a distinguished scientist can only be a he. But other than that, I think this quote answers the question that experience teaches you what is most likely going to be a possible problem that has tractable. Experience can tell you that, but experience cannot tell you whether a problem is impossible to solve. And that is where the youth that you talked about and a bit of arrogance of the youth that comes into play. And that's where youth and young people sometimes solve problems which many of us older people would decide are not, we are not capable of solving. I hope I have answered this question.
Thank you so much, Professor. This was a really amazing interview. And I think, like the goddess, you brought quite a lot of light into the darkness of what high energy physics is about, and how one has a very, very successful career in it. And we at Lifafa are very grateful to you for taking the time.
I'm very happy to talk to you. I've been happy to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have fun and all the best in your to both of you and your colleagues in this exercise that you're carrying out.